In September 1662, shortly after her 23rd birthday, Anne Orthwood sailed out of her native Bristol, England, toward the English colony of Virginia. Born to an unwed mother, Anne grew up with the stigma of being a bastard. Since Bristol was a thriving seaport, Anne probably heard that jobs in Virginia were plentiful and workers were few. Hundreds of people sailed from Bristol to Virginia every year, most of them poor young men who agreed to become indentured servants. Anne probably also heard about the shortage of women in Virginia. The promise of both work and marriage proved irresistible. In August 1662, Anne signed an indenture to a ship's surgeon who agreed to pay her way to Virginia in exchange for her agreement to work for 4 years as his servant. Anne's fate mirrored that of thousands of other indentured servants, the largest group of immigrants to England's southern colonies in the 17th century. When Anne arrived in Virginia, the surgeon sold her indenture, and thus her, to William Kendall, a wealthy planter and prominent official on Virginia's eastern shore. Kendall himself had come to Virginia as a servant in 1650, but unlike Anne, he was from a respectable family and had received a valuable education. When he became free in 1654, he amassed more than 25,000 acres of land, thanks to his 2 marriages to wealthy widows. When Anne joined Kendall's household, residing among 7 or 8 other servants, 2 slaves, a free black man, and numerous relatives, was Kendall's nephew, John. Like Anne, John was young, unmarried, and recently arrived from England. William Kendall refused to allow his nephew to get mixed up with a lowly servant woman, and a bastard at that. Kendall decided to separate Anne and John by selling her indenture, and thus her, to a tenant farmer who lived several miles away. As young people will, Anne and John found a way to get together. At a tavern in November 1663, Anne and John Kendall met. She became pregnant. Later, when pressed during childbirth as to who was the father, Anne admitted that it was John. After the birth of twin boys, Anne died, as did one of her babies. Her surviving son, Jasper, was indentured while still a baby to a Virginia planter. After 22 years of servitude, he became a free man. John Kendall never acknowledged Jasper as his son, but he did follow his Uncle William's advice and married a wealthy widow. Like so many other Virginia colonists, Anne gambled her freedom for the promise of a better life in Virginia, and she lost. Other former servants gambled and won, grandly like William and John Kendall, or more modestly like Anne's son Jasper. During the 17th century, English colonists learned how to grow enormous quantities of tobacco and export most of it to England. Tobacco production required hard labor and people who were willing, or could be forced, to do it. By the end of the century, the southern colonies had become sharply different from both New Spain and 17th century England. In ways unimaginable to the earliest settlers, the colonists paid homage to the international market and the English monarch by working hard to make a good living growing crops for export to England. The English colonization of North America took place in the midst of the English Reformation, which began with King Henry VIII's anxiety about securing a stable line of succession to maintain the Tudor dynasty. The younger of King Henry VII's 2 sons, Henry became heir apparent following the unexpected death of his brother Arthur, who had only recently married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Henry VII died in 1509, and Henry VIII assumed the throne, and then, rather controversially, married his brother's widow. They seemed to have a happy marriage at first, but she failed to produce any sons for Henry, giving birth only to one daughter, Mary, and so they began to grow apart. This may have had as much to do with the fact that Henry had become infatuated with one of the Queen's ladies' maids, Anne Boleyn, who came from a family that had embraced the Lutheran Reformation. Henry, however, despised Luther and published books refuting Protestant theology. In light of the fact that Catherine's advancing age meant that her ability to give Henry a son was fading, and his growing attraction to Anne, he petitioned Pope Leo X to grant him a divorce from Catherine so that he could marry Anne. Although divorce was technically forbidden by Catholic doctrine, popes often bent and broke all sorts of rules on behalf of nobles and royals, and this should have been no different, except that Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who would have taken it as an extreme insult for the king of a still minor power to humiliate a member of his family, so the divorce was refused. Henry then asked for an annulment of the marriage on the grounds that he had technically committed incest by marrying his former sister-in-law, but this sort of thing was fairly common in aristocratic families, and so there would be no annulment. Finally, and certainly with Anne's urging and support, Henry asserted royal supremacy over the Catholic Church in England, divorced Catherine, and married Anne in 1533, which was formalized by an act of Parliament the following year that created an independent Church of England no longer under Roman influence. Henry saw to the publication of the Bible in English and the composition of what would eventually become the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. But this does not mean that the Church of England was a Protestant church. It was Catholic in every respect, except that Rome had no say in Church of England affairs, and the king assumed the prerogative to select who would be the Archbishop of Canterbury. However, Anne was just as incapable of producing a male heir as Catherine, having only produced a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's eye wandered over to one of Anne's lady's maids, Jane Seymour, and before long Anne was caught up in a scandal in which she was accused of committing incest with her brother, who himself was accused of treason, and so likewise accused, she was executed at the Tower of London, and Henry married Jane. She gave birth to a son, Edward, and then died soon after of postpartum complications. Henry married 3 more women before his death in 1547, but sired no further children, and in the meantime Edward, who chronically suffered poor health and vitality, was presumed would die before he could succeed his father, and this led England's embittered Catholics and emboldened Protestants to jockey for political position. The Catholics prepared to put Mary on the throne, while the Protestants championed her half-sister, Elizabeth. Edward, however, survived childhood and took the throne as Edward VI upon his father's death in 1547, but he was still a minor and ruled through a regency council dominated by Protestants who proceeded to strip away as much of the Church of England's Catholic elements as possible. Still sickly and given to long bouts of illness, Edward finally died in 1553, and the Catholics successfully arranged for Mary to succeed him. A devout Catholic, Mary vowed to avenge her humiliated mother and reverse all of her father's and half-brothers' alienation of the Church of England from Rome, effectively restoring the Catholic Church. She arranged to marry her cousin, King Philip II of Spain, and set about trying to eradicate Protestantism from England using all of the horrible machinery of the Inquisition. Thousands of Protestants were prosecuted for heresy and executed. Many fled the country for parts of the continent, and some Protestants who slipped the dragnet became radicalized by the Marian persecution, devoting themselves to the reestablishment of the Church of England and its purification of all elements of Catholicism. Queen Mary struggled to get pregnant with a male heir and failed, and died unexpectedly in 1558, most likely of uterine cancer. Her behavior as queen alienated even many of England's Catholics, and so there was no impediment to Elizabeth's succession to the throne. Brought up as a Protestant, Queen Elizabeth I restored the Church of England to what it had been under her younger half-brother, Edward, and promised her Catholic subjects that there would be no reprisals against them so long as they accepted her and swore allegiance to her. Marian exiles from the continent returned to England, many of them committed to the purging of the Church of England of all taint of Romanism, thus earning them the nickname Puritans. But Elizabeth had little patience for them, and served notice that their radical theology would not replace the more liberal Protestantism of the Church of England. We'll hear more about them later. In the meantime, King Philip II greeted the news of Elizabeth's succession with surprise, thinking that he should have become King of England based on his marriage to its queen, and through his influence he sought to render England a pariah nation. Pope Pius V excommunicated her in 1570 and later issued a plenary indulgence to whomever might assassinate her, and absolved all English people from any allegiance to her. Philip II, for his part, began planning for a massive invasion of England to seize the throne, funneling the equivalent of many billions of dollars into building the largest naval fleet for this purpose, composed of many battleships that were the largest ever constructed. When everything was ready in 1588, he put in command of this fleet an army general who had never been on a boat before in his life. The Armada set sail, and Elizabeth had done her best to prepare, but lacking the kind of money Spain had, even with her state-sanctioned piracy against Spanish shipping on the Atlantic by her sea dogs Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, the best England could do was station as many ships as could be built, commandeered, and jury-rigged in the English Channel and hope for the best. As it happened, the English had an advantage in that their battleships were smaller, lighter, and faster, more maneuverable than the massive, heavy Spanish warships, and while the English artillery could barely dent the hulls of the big warships, they did a lot of damage to masts, sails, and rigging, which slowed them down. Hastily constructed barges, piled with flammable materials and satellite, called fire ships, and sent floating amidst the Armada likewise did a lot of damage, with the result that the Spanish fleet was disordered and could not sail into the Thames River to take London as planned. They regrouped off the East Anglian coast, and the decision was made to sail north and over the top of Scotland and down to invade from Bristol on the west coast. But as they reached the Atlantic side of Scotland, the Armada ran into the remnants of what must have been an enormous hurricane that caused most of the remaining ships to either sink or crash on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors drowned or were killed on the beaches by terrified locals, and any chances of a successful invasion was lost. The remnants of the Armada limped back to Spain, and Philip's ruinously expensive bid for the English throne likewise was lost, and contributed to the implosion of the Spanish economy. For England's Protestants, it was clear to them that not only was God a Protestant, but an Anglican at that, and they celebrated a deliverance that they could only see as the result of divine intervention. A newly confident England then embarked upon a career as a colonizing power in the New World. The attempted colonies at Roanoke were a disappointment, but lessons learned were applied to new plans to establish a foothold in Spanish-claimed North America. Queen Elizabeth oversaw the English Renaissance, most famous for producing William Shakespeare and the scientific revolution led by Sir Francis Bacon, and her early decision never to marry, instead wedding herself to the English nation, made her one of England's most beloved monarchs by the time of her death in 1603. Being the Virgin Queen, she had of course produced no heirs, and so the crown passed to her nearest relative, King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England as well, ruling an almost united Britain at the dawn of English America. In 1606, a group of wealthy investors created a joint stock venture, the Virginia Company, to establish a colony on the eastern coast of North America just north of the zone of effective Spanish control that Sir Walter Raleigh had named Virginia after his patron, Queen Elizabeth. In 1606, England's King James I granted the Virginia Company more than 6 million acres in North America. He hoped to create the English equivalent of Spain's New World Empire. Enthusiastic reports from the Roanoke voyages 20 years earlier claimed that in Virginia, quote, "the earth bringeth forth all things in abundance without toil or labor," end quote. Virginia Company investors hoped to profit by finding a valuable crop for colonists to export, discovering deposits of gold or silver, or raiding Spanish treasure ships. Such hopes failed to appreciate the difficulty of adapting English expectations to New World realities. The Jamestown settlement, named for the king, struggled to survive for nearly 2 decades until the royal government replaced the private Virginia Company, which never earned a profit. King James believed that England could encroach on the outskirts of Spain's New World Empire. An influential advocate of colonization claimed that God had reserved the lands lying north of Florida to be brought, quote, "unto Christian civility by the English nation," end quote. The king acted upon this sentiment by granting the Virginia Company a royal license to poach on both Spanish claims and the chiefdom of Powhatan, who ruled about 15,000 Algonquin Indians near the coast of the Chesapeake Bay. English merchants pooled their capital and shared risks by investing in joint stock companies like the Virginia Company. The London investors in the Virginia Company hoped not just to trade, but also to found an empire that would strengthen England. A proponent of colonization claimed that colonies would provide work for swarms of poor and homeless Englishmen. As colonists, these poor English youth could work, earn wages, and buy English goods while sending back resources to England that otherwise had to be imported from elsewhere. In pursuit of this plan, the ships Susan Constant, Discovery, and Godspeed carried 144 English colonists toward Virginia in December 1606. A few weeks after they arrived at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay in April 1607, they went ashore on a small peninsula of the territory ruled by Powhatan, where they quickly built a fort, the first building in Jamestown. The fort showed the colonists awareness that they needed to protect themselves from Indians and Spaniards. Spain planned to wipe Jamestown out, but never did. Powhatan's people, however, defended Virginia as their own. For weeks, the new settlers and Powhatan's warriors skirmished. English firearms repelled Indian attacks, but the Indians' superior numbers and knowledge of the wilderness made it risky for settlers to venture far beyond the fort. Many of the settlers at Jamestown were soldiers of fortune expecting to win great riches in their enterprise, not farmers who knew how to extract a modest living from the land. Half of them died in the first year, and recent archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of cannibalism. Modern findings from analyses of cypress tree growth rings indicate that English attempts to establish colonies at Roanoke and Jamestown occurred during one of the worst droughts ever to affect that area. English colonists had to contend with native power before they could finally establish a foothold and exploit the rich resources of the Potomac River system. The clash of Indians and Europeans is often depicted as one between hunters and farmers, but in the Potomac Valley, as in many other places, the contest between European and Indian farmers made the competition for the best lands deadly and the outcome catastrophic for native peoples. Few in number at first, and evidently inept in their new environment, the English settlers cannot have seemed much of a threat to the local Indians, members of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy that embraced some 30 tribes and extended across most of eastern Virginia. The Indians had been growing corn since the 14th century, and they supplied corn to the colonists. The paramount chief, Powhatan, seems to have tried to incorporate the English into his domain. Captain John Smith, the leader of the Virginia colonists, recalled several years later how he was captured by the Indians in December 1607 and saved from execution by Powhatan's daughter Pocahantas. No, not her. Probably someone who looks a bit more like Terrence Malick's version of Pocahontas in his film The New World, who Smith described in the General History of Virginia as, quote, a child of 12 or 13 years of age, end quote. According to Smith, Pocahontas threw her body across his at the moment of his execution, and Smith's account became legendary, perpetuated in history books and Disney movies for its romantic impact rather than its accuracy. In fact, if the events occurred as Smith described them, Pocahontas was most likely performing a prescribed role in a standard ritual by which Powhatan adopted Smith and made him a werowance, or subordinate chief. But Smith was not interested in becoming a secondary leader. Rather, he looked to Spanish experiences in Mexico as his guide to dealing with the Indians. The settlers soon confronted invisible dangers, disease and starvation. Salt water and fresh water mixed in the swampy marshlands surrounding Jamestown, creating an ecological zone where diseases thrived, especially since the colonists neglected careful sanitary habits. During the summer, many of the Englishmen lay night and day groaning in every corner of the fort, most pitiful to hear, wrote one of the settlers. The colonists increased their misery by bickering among themselves, leaving crops unplanted and food supplies shrinking. For the most part, the colonists died of mere famine, a settler wrote. There were never Englishmen left in a foreign country in such misery as we were in this newly discovered Virginia. Powhatan's people came to the rescue of the weakened and demoralized Englishmen. Early in September 1607, they began to bring corn to the colony for barter. Accustomed to eating food derived from wheat, English people considered corn an inferior food fit more for beasts than for humans. The hungry colonists soon overcame their prejudice against corn. Indians' corn acquired by both trade and plunder managed to keep 38 of the original settlers alive until a fresh supply of food and 120 more colonists arrived from England in January 1608. The Virginia Company sent hundreds of new settlers to Jamestown each year, each of them eager to find the promised paradise, but most settlers went to early graves. Powhatan's people stayed in contact with English settlers but maintained their distance. For one thing, the colonists smelled bad since they rarely bathed, unlike the Indians. The Virginia Company boasted that the settlers bought from the Indians, quote, the pearls of earth and gave to them the pearls of heaven, end quote. In fact, few Indians became Christians, and the English devoted little effort to converting them. Marriage between Indian women and English men was rare, despite the tiny number of English women in Virginia during the early years. Few settlers bothered to learn the Indians' languages. Powhatan's people regarded the English with suspicion for good reason. Although the settlers often made friendly overtures to the Indians, they did not hesitate to use their guns and swords to enforce English notions of proper Indian behavior. When Indians refused to trade their corn to the settlers, the English pillaged their villages and confiscated their corn. The Indians retaliated against English violence, but for 15 years they did not organize an all-out assault on the European intruders, probably for several reasons. Although Christianity held few attractions for the Indians, the power of the settlers' God impressed them. Powhatan probably concluded that these powerful strangers would make better allies than enemies. As allies, the English strengthened Powhatan's rule over the tribes in the region. The colonists also traded with Powhatan's people, usually exchanging European goods for corn. Native Virginians eagerly traded corn to obtain the intruders' iron and steel, knives, axes, and pots. But why were the settlers unable to feed themselves for more than a decade? First, as the high death rate suggests, many settlers were too sick to be productive. Second, very few farmers came to Virginia in the early years. Instead, most of the newcomers were gentlemen and their servants who, in Smith's words, never did know what a day's work was. The proportion of gentlemen in Virginia in the early years was 6 times greater than in England, a reflection of the Virginia Company's urgent need for investors and settlers. John Smith declared repeatedly that in Virginia, quote, there is no country to pillage as in New Spain. All you can expect from Virginia must be by labor, end quote. For years, however, colonists clung to ideas that made more sense in labor-rich England than in labor-poor Virginia. Let us bring Mataoaks back into the picture. The evidence seems to indicate that her interest in the English facilitated her father making her a go-between between them and the Powhatans, and this led to her decision to marry the newly selected governor of Virginia, John Rolfe, in 1614. She converted to Christianity and took the name Rebeckah. Whether this was a marriage of political convenience or a genuine love match is not known, but if she and her father thought it might temper the behavior of the Jamestown settlers, they miscalculated. Although there was a measure of peace between 1614 and 1622, this seems to have more to do with Rolfe clamping down hard on the Virginians' worst inclinations and the Powhatans' military weakness than anything else. In 1616, the Rolfes, with their 2-year-old son, sailed to England to raise funds to keep Virginia going, and for Rebeckah to be the centerpiece of a publicity tour. She seemed to take to English dress and customs readily, and spoke English with great fluency. There is an apocryphal story about a meeting between her and Captain Smith that I hope is true. Since leaving Virginia in 1609, Smith wrote the General History of Virginia, in which he related the story about her saving his life because she had fallen in love with him. The story goes that they attended a royal reception, and that upon seeing her, Smith eagerly approached her for a long-awaited reunion. When he greeted her, she is said to have turned her back on him and walked away without saying a word, suggesting that she had heard his ridiculous story, and thus repaid him with a mannerly rebuke that certainly would have embarrassed him before so many courtiers and nobles. What is known is that while in England Rebeckah fell ill, probably of smallpox, and died in 1617, just days before the Rolfes were scheduled to sail back to Virginia. She was buried in Gravesend near London, and her death seems to mark a turning point in Anglo-Indian relations in Virginia. The Virginia colony created difficulties for Powhatan's chiefdom. Steady contact between natives and newcomers spread European diseases among the Indians, who suffered deadly epidemics. To produce enough corn for trade with the English, Indian women had to spend more time growing and harvesting crops. But from the Indians' viewpoint, the most important fact about the always hungry colonists was that they were not going away. Powhatan died in 1618, and his brother Opechancanough replaced him as supreme chief. In 1622, Opechancanough organized an all-out assault on the English settlers. As an English colonist observed, "When the day appointed for the massacre arrived, a number of savages visited many of our people in their dwellings, and while partaking with them of their meal, the savages, at a given signal, drew their weapons and fell upon us, murdering and killing everybody they could reach, sparing neither women nor children." In all, the Indians killed 347 colonists, nearly a third of the English population. But the attack failed to dislodge the colonists. Instead, in the years to come, the settlers unleashed a murderous campaign of Indian extermination that pushed the Indians far beyond the frontiers of white settlement. After 1622, most colonists considered Indians their perpetual enemies. In the immediate aftermath of the 1622 attack, the survivors became demoralized. The disaster prompted a royal investigation of affairs in Virginia. The investigators discovered that the high death rate among the colonists was caused more by disease and mismanagement than by Indian raids. In 1624, King James canceled the charter of the Virginia Company and made Virginia a royal colony. Now, the king, rather than the private investors of the Virginia Company, ruled the colony, an arrangement that lasted until 1776. The king appointed the governor of Virginia and his council, but other features of local government established under the Virginia Company remained intact. In 1619, for example, the company inaugurated the House of Burgesses, an assembly of representatives elected by the colony's inhabitants. Under the new royal government, laws passed by the Burgesses had to be approved by the king's bureaucrats in England rather than by the Virginia Company. Otherwise, the House of Burgesses continued as before, making it the oldest representative lawmaking assembly in the English colonies. Under the new royal government, all free adult men in Virginia could vote for the House of Burgesses, which was far more democratic than the English House of Commons. The failure of the Virginia Company marked the end of the first phase of colonization of the Chesapeake region. From the first 105 adventurers in 1607, the population had grown to about 1,200 by 1624. Despite death rates higher than the worst epidemics in London, new settlers still came. Their arrival and King James's willingness to take over the struggling colony reflected a fundamental change in Virginia. After years of experimentation, it was finally becoming clear that English settlers could make a fortune in Virginia by growing tobacco. Tobacco grew wild in the New World, and Native Americans used it for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Many 16th century European explorers noticed the Indians' habit of, quote-unquote, drinking smoke. Sailors returning from the New World, according to one Spanish observation, quote, suck in as much smoke as they can, and in this way they say that their hunger and thirst are allayed, their strength is restored, and their spirits are refreshed, and their brains are lulled by a joyous intoxication, end quote. That joyous intoxication made tobacco irresistible to most Europeans. At the beginning of the 17th century, tobacco was scarce and therefore expensive. In 1603, for example, England imported only about 25,000 pounds of tobacco, all from New Spain. By 1700, England imported more than 35 million pounds of tobacco, almost all from the Chesapeake colonies. The huge increase in the tobacco supply caused prices to plummet. A quantity of tobacco that sold for $1 in 1600 cost less than 2.5 cents by 1700. Interestingly, the tobacco boom in England almost never happened. King James I, when shown tobacco and how it is smoked, and having seen smoking begin to become fashionable in London and even at his court, described it as the stinking weed. According to a treatise he himself wrote against tobacco smoking, he said, "It is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit. He was on the verge of banning it from his court and from being sold in the British Isles, but the potential for profit was too great, so he only forbade smoking at all of his palaces and anywhere near his person, and otherwise took a share in the profits generated from the tobacco boom. The low prices made possible by bumper crops harvested by planters in the Chesapeake transformed tobacco consumption in England and elsewhere in Europe. Annual per capita tobacco use in England grew more than 200-fold during the 17th century. As the English king observed, the Chesapeake colonies were, quote, wholly built upon smoke, end quote. By 1700, nearly 100,000 colonists lived in the Chesapeake region, including present-day Virginia, Maryland, and northern North Carolina. Although the colonists differed in wealth, landholding, access to labor, and religion, they shared a dedication to growing tobacco. In 1700, they exported more than 35 million pounds of tobacco, 5 times more per capita than in 1620. Chesapeake colonists clearly mastered the demands of tobacco agriculture. Settlers lived by the rhythms of tobacco agriculture. Their endless need for labor attracted droves of English indentured servants to grueling work in tobacco fields with the promise of eventual freedom. Governor John Rolfe planted West Indian tobacco seeds in 1612 and learned that they flourished in Virginia. By 1617, the colonists had grown enough tobacco to send the first commercial shipment to England, where it sold for a high price. After that, Virginia pivoted from a colony of rather aimless adventurers to a society of dedicated tobacco planters. A demanding crop, tobacco required close attention and a great deal of hand labor year-round. Like the Indians, the colonists cleared fields by cutting a ring of bark around each tree, a process known as girdling, which killed the tree. Girdling brought sunlight to clearings but left fields studded with tree stumps that made plowing nearly impossible. Instead, colonists tilled their tobacco fields with heavy hoes. English settlers worked hard because their labor promised greater rewards in the Chesapeake region than in England. One colonist proclaimed that, quote, the dirt of this province affords as great a profit to the general inhabitant as the gold of Peru doth to the Spaniard, end quote. Although he was exaggerating, a hired man could in fact expect to earn 2 or 3 times more in Virginia's tobacco fields than in England. Better still, in Virginia, land was so abundant that it was extremely cheap compared with land in England. By the mid-17th century, common laborers could buy 100 acres of land for less than their annual wages, which was impossible in England. To encourage settlement, the royal government even gave new settlers who paid their own transportation to the Chesapeake a grant of 50 acres of free land, called a head right. Head rights, cheap land, and high wages gave poor English folk like Anne Orthwood powerful incentives to immigrate to the New World. Yet many poor people could not scrape together the money to pay for a trip across the Atlantic. Their poverty and the colonists' crying need for labor led to the creation of a servant labor system. About 80% of the immigrants to the Chesapeake during the 17th century came as indentured servants. Instead of a society based on slave labor, the 17th century Chesapeake region was mainly a society of white servants and ex-servants. Relatively few African slaves were brought to the Chesapeake in the half-century after settlement. The first known Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619 aboard the White Lion, an English privateer that seized them from a Portuguese slave ship bound for South America. The 20 and odd Negroes, as one colonist called them, had been captured and enslaved in Angola in west central Africa. A few more slaves trickled into the Chesapeake region during the next several decades. Until the 1670s, however, only a small number of enslaved people labored in Chesapeake tobacco fields. Some men and women of African descent occasionally became indentured servants, served out their terms of servitude, and became free. A few slaves escaped bondage by purchasing their freedom. These people were exceptions, however. Almost all people of African descent in the Chesapeake region were enslaved for life. A fascinating example of such an exception is Anthony Johnson. It is theorized that he may have been one of the original 20 Africans captured from the Dutch and brought to Virginia, a manifest indicating that one of the slaves was named Antonio, but this cannot be verified. However, he does seem to have been an Angolan who, if not brought directly to Virginia in 1619, may have spent some time on a sugar plantation in Cuba before coming to Virginia no later than 1621 to live on a plantation owned by Edward Bennett. He survived Opechacano's attack in 1622, and in 1625 married a slave woman named Mary who would bear him 4 children. At some point, he and Mary are believed to have been sold to another planter by the name of Johnson, who apparently allowed Anthony to purchase his and his family's freedom sometime between 1635 and 1640 with money earned working side jobs. This in itself is an incredible feat, since self-purchase, to say nothing of buying out one's spouse and children, depends upon the owner's willingness to sell and disposition toward the purchaser, so it would seem that Anthony had acquired some measure of status and respect, and took the surname Johnson either out of gratitude or because his former master's name carried weight in Tidewater society and perhaps would support Anthony if he should ever encounter difficulties. By 1650, the Johnsons moved to Northampton and may have enjoyed the patronage of their former master, Edward Bennett. Eventually, Anthony purchased 250 acres of land on Pungateague Creek on the eastern shore of the Delmarva Peninsula, where he embarked upon a career as a successful yeoman farmer, adding another 250 acres through the headright system and becoming a commercial tobacco farmer and owner of several slaves and white indentured servants. Court records show that he won a judgment against a white neighbor for the attempted theft of one of his slaves, but otherwise seems to have enjoyed harmonious relations with his neighbors. His 2 eldest sons purchased substantial acreages adjacent to their father's farm in 1652 when they got married and started their own families. A fire destroyed a large chunk of Anthony's farm in 1653, for which the Virginia government granted him a period of tax relief that allowed him to get back on his feet. Again, extraordinary, considering that he was a former slave. The Johnsons sold their lands and moved to Somerset County, Maryland, in the mid-1660s, and while the elder sons expanded their holdings, including the repurchase by John Johnson of the original family farm on Pungateague Creek, Anthony gave his Somerset County farm to his sons and leased a 300-acre tract that he called Tony's Vineyard, passing away in 1672. In 1677, his grandson, John Jr., bought a 44-acre tract in Somerset County that he named Angola, presumably after his grandfather's homeland. Johnson's widow, Mary, took her husband's place as mistress of the Johnson farm, negotiating a 99-year lease on Tony's Vineyard, the annual rent for which was a single ear of Indian corn. The unprecedented success of the Johnsons suggests the fluidity of race relations in the 17th century Chesapeake, but also to the possibilities available to poor Virginians of sufficient talent and personal connections. It must be emphasized, though, that the Johnson family saga unfolded in a Chesapeake region where the enslaved were highly outnumbered by white indentured servants, but fast becoming a larger and larger minority of the population as the century neared its turning. The great majority of indentured servants were white people from England, like Anne Orthwood. To buy passage aboard a ship bound for the Chesapeake, a person had to come up with about a year's wages. Earning wages at all was difficult in England since job opportunities were shrinking. Many landowners needed fewer farm hands because they shifted from growing crops to raising sheep in newly enclosed fields. Unemployed people drifted into English seaports such as Bristol, Liverpool, and London, where they learned about the plentiful jobs in North America. Unable to pay for their trip across the Atlantic, poor immigrants agreed to a contract called an indenture, which functioned as a form of credit. By signing an indenture, an immigrant borrowed the cost of transportation to the Chesapeake from a merchant or ship captain in England. To repay this loan, the indentured person agreed to work in the colonies as a servant for 4 to 7 years. Once the indentured person arrived in the colonies, the merchant or ship captain sold his contract for the immigrant's labor to a local tobacco planter. The planter paid about twice the cost of transportation and agreed to provide the servant with food and shelter. When the indenture expired, the planter owed the former servant freedom dues, usually a few barrels of corn and a suit of clothes, possibly also tools and maybe even a little bit of cash. Ideally, indentures allowed poor immigrants like Anne Orthwood to trade their most valuable assets, their freedom and their ability to work, for a trip to the New World and a period of servitude followed by freedom in a land of opportunity. Planters reaped more immediate benefits. Servants meant more hands to grow more tobacco. A planter expected a servant to grow enough tobacco in 1 year to cover the price the planter paid for the indenture. Servants labored during the remaining 3 to 6 years of the indenture promised a handsome profit for the planter. No wonder one Virginian declared, "Our principal wealth consisteth in servants." Although many servants died before their indentures expired, like Orthwood did, planters still profited because they received a head right of 50 acres of land from the colonial government for every newly purchased servant. About 3 out of 4 servants were young men between the ages of 15 and 25 when they arrived in the Chesapeake. Typically, they shared the desperation of 16-year-old Francis Hares, who indentured himself for 7 years because, according to his contract, his father and mother and all friends are dead, and he is a miserable wandering boy. Like Francis, most servants had no special training or skills, although the majority had some experience with agricultural work. A skilled craftsman could obtain a shorter indenture, but few risked coming to the colonies since their prospects were better in England. Women were almost as rare as skilled craftsmen in the Chesapeake and much more desired. In the early days of the tobacco boom, the Virginia Company shipped young single women servants to the colony as prospective wives for male settlers willing to pay, quote, 120 pounds of the best leaf tobacco for each of them, end quote. Even so, women remained a small minority of the Chesapeake population until the late 17th century. The servant labor system reinforced the gender imbalance. Although female servants cost about the same as men and generally served for the same length of time, planters preferred male servants because, as one explained, they were, quote, the more excellent and useful creatures, end quote, for field work. Servant women hoed and harvested tobacco fields and did household chores such as cooking, washing, cleaning, gardening, and milking. Servant life was harsh by the standards of 17th century England and even by the frontier standards of the Chesapeake. Unlike servants in England, Chesapeake servants like Anne Orthwood had no control over who purchased their labor and them for the duration of their indenture. They were sold here up and down like horses, one observer reported. But tobacco planters' need for labor silenced complaints about treating servants as property. Some servants became free and prospered, as Anne Orthwood's master William Kendall did. Many other servants did not feel well used and respected when confronted by the rigors of labor in tobacco fields. Severe laws aimed to keep servants in their proper places. James Revell, an 18-year-old indentured to a Virginia tobacco planter, declared he was a slave sent to hoe tobacco plants all day from dawn to dusk. Punishments for servants' petty crimes stretched servitude far beyond the original terms of indenture. Richard Higbee, for example, received 6 extra years of servitude for killing 3 hogs. After mid-century, the Virginia legislature added 3 or more years to the indentures of most servants by requiring them to serve until they were 24 years old. Women servants like Anne Orthwood were subject to special restrictions. They could not marry until their servitude expired. A servant woman, the law assumed, could not serve 2 masters at the same time, one who owned her indentured labor and another who was her husband. Since men greatly outnumbered women, servant women were pressured to engage in sexual relations regardless of marriage. As a rule, if a female servant became pregnant, she had to serve 2 extra years and pay a fine because lawmakers believed caring for her child would rob her owner of part of her labor. If she died, as Anne Orthwood did, her child would become a servant until the child turned 21, as Anne's son Jasper did. Such harsh punishments reflected 4 fundamental realities of the servant labor system. First, planters' need for labor caused them to demand as much labor as they could get from their servants. Second, servants hoped to survive their servitude and use their freedom to obtain land and start a family. Third, since servants saw themselves as free people temporarily in servitude, They often made grudging, half-hearted workers. Finally, planters put up with this arrangement because the alternatives were less desirable. Planters could not easily hire free men and women because land was readily available and free people preferred to work for themselves on their own land. Nor could planters depend on much labor from family members because families were few or started late and thus produced few children. And until the 1680s and 1690s, enslaved Africans were expensive and hard to come by. Before then, masters who wanted to grow more tobacco had few alternatives to buy indentured servants. As the story of Anthony Johnson suggests, and many primary sources indicate, before the 1660s, slavery was not clearly defined in Virginia or Maryland statute books. From the 1620s through the 1640s, it is abundantly clear that white Englishmen were unsure about the nature of African American slavery. It is not even certain that very many of them assumed black racial inferiority in those first decades, although this conviction grew into conventional wisdom by the 18th century. Prior to 1660, servants and slaves worked, lived, dined, and slept alongside each other, performed the same tasks, and were treated by their masters with relatively equal measures of consideration and cruelty. The only difference was that slaves were assumed to be slaves for life, while servants were slaves only for a short period of years. While this difference certainly differentiated the basic experience of servants and slaves, when the white servant and the black slave felt the overseer's lash equally or were punished for identical infractions with more or less the same punishments, that difference came to matter very little in their shared day-to-day lives. By the 1660s, increasing numbers of masters and magistrates wrung their hands over the growing numbers of mixed-race children being born to servant-slave liaisons, newly emancipated servants seeking to purchase enslaved spouses and lovers, and the few enterprising freedmen like Anthony Johnson joining the ranks of yeomen and commercial farmers, and even the planter elite. As a result, both colonies' legislatures began to pass laws confining indentured servitude to whites and slavery to blacks, defining slavery as a lifelong condition and severely limiting the possibilities for emancipation, decreeing that the children of female slaves were automatically slaves themselves, while the children of white mothers were free, even as slave men who fathered children by white women were automatically guilty of rape, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the conception of said children. Masters of servants and slaves were enjoined to set servants to lighter tasks about the farm and harder, more grueling work to the slaves in order to differentiate their everyday experiences. Punishments for various infractions were to go lighter on the servants and heavier on the slaves. Servants and slaves were to be housed in separate quarters, and their ability to mix socially restricted as much as possible. Villages and small towns dotted the rural landscape of 17th century England, but in the Chesapeake, towns were few and far between. Instead, tobacco farms occupied small clearings surrounded by hundreds of acres of wilderness. Since tobacco was a labor-intensive crop that quickly exhausted the fertility of the soil, each farmer cultivated only 5 or 10% of his land at any one time. Tobacco planters sought land with access to a navigable river in order to minimize the work of transporting the heavy barrels of tobacco onto ships. A settled region of the Chesapeake was therefore a network of tobacco farms located near waterways. Most Chesapeake colonists were Protestants rather than Catholics. All English colonists were required to attend worship services on Sunday and to conform to the rituals and beliefs of the Church of England. Few ministers migrated to the Chesapeake, however, and many of them did not uphold high standards of piety and devotion. Certainly some colonists took their religion seriously. Church courts punished sinners and served notice on parishioners who spent Sundays, quote-unquote, going a-fishing. But on the whole, religion did not awaken the zeal of Chesapeake settlers. The religion of the Chesapeake colonists was Anglican in word and form, but their faith lay in the turbulent, competitive, high-stakes gamble of survival as tobacco planters. Like Virginia, the Catholic colony of Maryland worshipped at the altar of tobacco. In 1632, England's King Charles I granted his Catholic friend, Cecilius Calvert, Lord Baltimore, about 6.5 million acres in the northern Chesapeake region. Lord Baltimore intended to create a refuge for Catholics who suffered severe discrimination in England. He fitted out 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove, gathered about 150 settlers, and sent them to the new colony, where they arrived in March 1634. Maryland, however, failed to live up to Baltimore's hopes. The colony's population grew very slowly for 20 years, and most settlers were Protestants rather than Catholics. The religious turmoil of the Puritan Revolution in England spilled across the Atlantic, creating conflict between Maryland's few Catholics, most of them wealthy and prominent, and the Protestant majority, most of them neither wealthy nor prominent. Maryland's leaders hoped to attract decent people as servants, unlike those in Virginia, described by one Marylander as the scum of the people, vagrants and runaways from their masters, debauched, idle, lazy squanderers, and jailbirds. During the 1660s, however, Maryland began to attract settlers very much like Virginia's, and most of them were Protestants. Although Catholics continued to exert influence in Maryland, the colony's society, economy, politics, and culture became nearly indistinguishable from Virginia's. Both colonies shared a devotion to tobacco, the true faith of the Chesapeake. The servant labor system increased inequality in Chesapeake society and led to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. The rebellion prompted reforms that stabilized relations between elite planters and their lesser neighbors. The reforms paved the way for a social hierarchy that emphasized racial differences and diverted attention from inequality in landholding and wealth. Amid this social and political evolution, Chesapeake colonists' dedication to growing tobacco never changed. The first half of the 17th century in the Chesapeake was the era of the yeoman, a free farmer who owned a small plot of land sufficient to support a family and worked largely by servants and a few family members. The first half of the 17th century in the Chesapeake was the era of the yeoman, a free farmer who owned a small plot of land sufficient to support a family and worked largely by himself and a few family members. Some commercial farmers, like Anthony Johnson, owned a handful of servants and/or slaves, while a small number of elite planters had larger estates and commanded 10 or more servants. But for the first several decades, few men lived long enough to accumulate fortunes that set them much apart from their neighbors. Until mid-century, the principal division in Chesapeake society was less between rich and poor planters than between free farmers and servants. Although these two groups contrasted sharply in their legal and economic status, their daily lives had many similarities. Servants looked forward to the time when their indentures would expire and they too would become free and eventually own land. 3 major developments splintered this rough frontier equality during the third quarter of the century. First, as planters grew more and more tobacco, the ample supply depressed tobacco prices in European markets. Cheap tobacco reduced planters' profits and made saving enough to become landowners more difficult for freed servants. Second, because the death rate in the Chesapeake colonies declined, more and more servants survived their indentures, causing landless freemen to become more numerous and discontented. Third, declining death rates also encouraged the formation of a planter elite. By living longer, successful planters became even more successful. The wealthiest planters also began to buy slaves as well as to set themselves up as merchants. By the 1670s, the society of the Chesapeake had become polarized. Landowners, the planter elite and their more numerous yeoman planters and commercial farmers, clustered around one pole. Landless colonists, mainly free former servants, surrounded the other pole. Each group eyed the other with suspicion and mistrust. For the most part, planters saw landless freemen as a dangerous rabble rather than as fellow colonists with legitimate grievances. Virginia's governor, William Berkeley, feared the political threat to the ruling elite posed by, quote, 6 parts in 7 of Virginia colonists who are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed, end quote. In general, government enforced the difference between servants and masters with an iron fist. Poor men complained that neither the governor nor council could or would do any poor men right, but that they would show great favor to great men and wrong the poor. Most Chesapeake colonists, like most Europeans, assumed that great men should bear the responsibilities of government. Until 1670, all freemen could vote, and they routinely elected prosperous planters to the legislature. No former servant served in either the governor's council or the House of Burgesses after 1640. Yet poor Virginians believed that the great men used government offices to promote their selfish personal interests rather than governing impartially. As discontent grew among poor colonists during the 1660s and 1670s, colonial officials tried to keep political power in safe hands. Beginning in 1661, for example, Governor Berkeley did not call an election for the House of Burgesses for 15 years. In 1670, the House of Burgesses outlawed voting by poor men, allowing only men who were both landowners and heads of households to vote. The king also began to tighten the royal government's control of trade in order to strengthen the monarchy and to collect more revenue from the Chesapeake colonies. A series of English laws funneled colonial trade exclusively into the hands of English merchants and shippers. The Navigation Acts of 1650 and 1651 specified that colonial goods had to be transported in English ships with predominantly English crews. A 1660 act required colonial products to be sent only to English ports. A 1663 law provided that all goods sent to the colonies must pass through English ports and be carried on English ships manned by English sailors. Taken together, these navigation acts reflected the English government's belief in mercantilism, namely that what was good for England, channeling all trade through English hands, should determine colonial policy. Mercantilism underlay the import duty on tobacco imposed by the Navigation Act of 1660. The law placed an import tax of 2 pence on every pound of colonial tobacco brought into England, which was about as much as a Chesapeake farmer received for growing tobacco. The import tax gave the king a major financial interest in the size of the tobacco crop, which yielded about a quarter of all English import taxes during the 1660s. Colonists, like residents of European monarchies, accepted class divisions and inequality as long as they believed that government officials ruled for the general good. When rulers violated that expectation, ordinary people believed rebellion was justified. In 1676, Bacon's rebellion began as a dispute over Virginia's Indian policy. Before it ended, the rebellion caused upheaval throughout Chesapeake politics and society, leaving in its wake death, destruction, and hostility between the great planters and their poorer neighbors. Opechecanough, the Powhatan chief who had led the Indian attack of 1622 in Virginia, organized another surprise attack in 1644, killing about 500 Virginia colonists in 2 days. During the next 2 years of bitter fighting, the colonists eventually gained the upper hand and murdered the elderly chief. After the war, the Indians gave up all claims to land already settled by the English. In return, the Indians received a guarantee that wilderness land beyond the fringe of English settlement belonged exclusively to the Indians. The colonial government hoped this arrangement would reduce contact between settlers and Indians and maintain peace. The policy might have worked if the Chesapeake population had not grown, but the number of land-hungry colonists multiplied. In their quest for land, they encroached steadily on Indian land. During the 1660s and 1670s, violence between colonists and Indians repeatedly flared along the frontier. The government, located in the tidewatered region near the coast, far from the danger of Indian raids, tried to calm the conflict and reestablish peace. Frontier settlers thirsted for revenge against what their leader, Nathaniel Bacon, termed the protected and darling Indians. Bacon proclaimed his design not only to ruin and extirpate all Indians in general, but all manner of trade and commerce with them. Bacon also urged the colonists to see what sponges have sucked up the public treasure. He charged that grandees, or elite planters, operated the government for their private gain, a charge that made sense to many colonists. In fact, office holders had profited enough to buy slaves to replace their servants. By the 1660s, government officials owned about 70% of all the colony's slaves. Bacon voiced the grievances of the small planters and poor farmers against both the Indians and the colonial rulers in Jamestown. Hoping to maintain the fragile peace on the frontier in 1676, Governor Berkeley pronounced Bacon a rebel, threatened to punish him for treason, and called for new elections of burgesses who Berkeley believed would support his get-tough policy. To Berkeley's surprise, the elections backfired. Almost all the old burgesses were voted out of office. Replacing them were local leaders, including Bacon, who criticized the rule of the elite planters. In June 1676, the new legislature passed reform measures known as Bacon's Laws. Among other changes, the laws gave local settlers a voice in setting tax rates, forbade office holders from demanding bribes or extra fees for carrying out their duties, placed limits on holding more than one office at a time, and restored the vote to all freemen. The reforms motivated elite planters to convince Governor Berkeley that Bacon and his men were a greater threat than the Indians. When Bacon learned that Berkeley had once again branded him a traitor, he declared war against Berkeley and the grandees. Bacon found ready support from frontier yeomen and tenant farmers, indentured servants, and slaves. The lattermost offered their freedom once Bacon was installed as governor, and this last aspect of Bacon's rebellion proved most disturbing to Governor Berkeley and the colony's elites. The servants' and slaves' willingness to make common cause for their freedom spurred an initially hesitant Berkeley to forcefully quash the rebellion. For 3 months, Bacon's forces fought Indians, destroyed grandees' plantations, and attacked Jamestown. Berkeley's loyalists retaliated by plundering the homes of Bacon's supporters. The fighting continued until Bacon unexpectedly died, most likely from dysentery, and several English ships arrived to increase Berkeley's strength. With the rebellion crushed, Berkeley hanged several of Bacon's allies and destroyed farms that belonged to Bacon's supporters. The rebellion did nothing to remove the grandees from their positions of power. If anything, it strengthened them. When the king learned of the turmoil in the Chesapeake and its devastating effect on tobacco exports and customs duties, he ordered an investigation. Royal officials replaced Berkeley with a governor more attentive to the king's interests, nullified Bacon's laws, and imposed an export tax on tobacco as a way to pay the expenses of the colony's government without getting the consent of the tight-fisted House of Burgesses. In the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, tensions between great planters and small farmers moderated. The ruling elite concluded that it was safer for the colonists to fight the Indians than to fight each other, and the government made little effort to restrict settlers' encroachment on Indian lands. The export duty on tobacco allowed the colonial government to reduce taxes on all free Virginians by 75% between 1660 and 1700, a very popular policy. In the long run, however, the most important contribution to political stability was the declining importance of the servant labor system. During the 1680s and 1690s, fewer servants arrived in the Chesapeake, partly because of improving economic conditions in England. Fewer immigrants meant that the number of poor, newly freed servants also declined. In 1700, about 1/3 of freed colonists still worked as tenants on land owned by others, but the Chesapeake was in the midst of transitioning to a slave labor system that de-emphasized the differences between poor farmers and rich planters and magnified the differences between whites and blacks. Although much was done to try to separate white from black, a court case from Henrico County, Virginia in 1681 shows that the success of the government's and society's measures was somewhat limited. One Friday afternoon in August, Thomas Cox's servants were in their master's orchard cutting down weeds. The gang included at least 2 white men in their mid-20s, presumably servants, and at least 3 slaves. After work, this mixed crew began drinking in their quarters. They offered apple cider to other white visitors, one of whom was Catherine Watkins, a married woman who, quote-unquote, drank cup for cup with the Negroes. According to court testimony, she pulled out the tucked shirt of one slave, named Dirk, saying, quote, he would have a good prick, and grabbed the crotch of another slave named Mulatto Jack and said she, quote, loved him for his father's sake, for his father was a very handsome young man, end quote, embracing him, quote, about the neck, and then flinging him on the bed where she, quote, kissed him and put her hand into his codpiece, end quote. Something more happened after that, and later she accused Jack of rape, claiming that he had, quote, put his yard into her and ravished her, end quote. Virginia law prevented Jack from speaking in his own defense, but the white servants and witnesses, with only one exception, testified to Catherine's amorous behavior and that the sex between her and Jack was not only consensual, but instigated by Catherine herself. Jack was acquitted of the charges, and Catherine subjected to a public lashing for having sexual relations with a slave and for bearing false witness in a royal court. The noteworthy aspects of this case are that free and unfree white people came to the defense of a black slave who was apparently a friend and one who was wrongfully accused by a woman whose libidinous reputation was well known. This may have made a crucial difference in Jack's favor. In any case, the potential consequences for Jack were dire, as rape was a capital crime punishable by death, and the trial of John Long speaks to the complicated nature of black-white relations in the 17th century Chesapeake. Unlike the Spaniards in New Spain, English colonists did not succeed in forcing Indians to become laborers. They turned instead to another source of workers used by the Spaniards and Portuguese, enslaved Africans. European colonizers eventually built African slavery into the most important form of coerced labor in the New World. During the 17th century, English colonies in the West Indies followed the Spanish and Portuguese examples and developed sugar plantations with slave labor. In the English North American colonies, however, a slave labor system did not emerge until the last quarter of the 17th century. During the 1670s, settlers from Barbados brought slavery to the new English mainland colony of Carolina, where the imprint of the West Indies remained strong for decades. In Chesapeake tobacco fields at about the same time, slave labor began to replace servant labor, the crucial step in the transition to a society of freedom for whites and slavery for Africans. While English colonies in Chesapeake grew and prospered with the tobacco trade, the northern outposts of the Spanish Empire in New Mexico and Florida stagnated. Only about 1,500 Spaniards lived in Florida, and roughly twice as many inhabited New Mexico. Yet both colonies required costly deliveries of supplies. Instead of attracting settlers and growing crops for export, New Mexico and Florida housed soldiers and Spanish missionaries who tried to convert Indians to Christianity. In both colonies, Indians outnumbered Spaniards 10 or 20 to 1. Royal officials hoped that the missionaries would pacify the Indians and be a relatively cheap way to preserve Spain's footholds in North America. The missionaries baptized thousands of Indians in New Mexico and Florida during the 17th century, but they also planted the seeds of Indian uprisings against Spanish rule. Dozens of missionaries came to Florida and New Mexico, as one announced, to free the Indians, quote, from the miserable slavery of the demon and from the obscure darkness of their idolatry. The missionaries followed royal instructions that Indians should be taught to live in a civilized manner, clothed and wearing shoes, and given the use of bread, linen, horses, cattle, tools, and weapons, and all the rest that Spain has had. In effect, the missionaries sought to convert the Indians not just to Christianity, but also to ways of life that Spaniards considered civilized. The missionaries sponsored scores of Catholic churches across Florida and New Mexico. Adopting common practices in New Spain, they forced Indians to construct these churches and to pay tribute in the form of food, blankets, and other goods. Although the missionaries congratulated themselves on the many Indians they converted, their coercive methods undermined their goals. A missionary reported that an Indian in New Mexico said to him, "If you who are Christians cause so much harm and violence to us, why should we become Christians?" The Indians retaliated repeatedly against Spanish exploitation, but the Spaniards suppressed the violent uprisings by taking advantage of the disunity among the Indians, much as Cortés did in the conquest of Mexico. In 1680, after years of economic and religious oppression, the Rio Grande Pueblos rose in synchronized revolt against the Spaniards. The Pueblo Revolt was one of the most effective Indian resistance movements in American history, what the late Pueblo historian Joe S. Sando called, quote, the First American Revolution. For more than 80 years, Pueblo peoples had endured Spanish persecution of their religious practices, Spanish demands for corn and labor, and Spanish abuses of their women. New diseases, as well as famines resulting from the disruption of their traditional economies, had scythed their numbers from as many as 100,000 in the late 16th century to a mere 17,000 by 1680. Many Pueblos blamed their misfortunes on Spanish assaults on the religious ceremonies that kept their world in balance, and there was a resurgence of the ancient rituals. Spanish officials responded with intensified oppression. In 1675, they hanged 3 Pueblo religious leaders and whipped many others. Meanwhile, drought produced food scarcities among plains nomads to the east, and the Apaches stepped up their raids on Pueblo farming communities. By 1680, the Pueblos were facing crisis. They could no longer save themselves by coexistence and accommodation. The move to open confrontation came initially from northern Pueblo leaders. The Spaniards credited Pope, a medicine man from San Juan Pueblo who had been publicly flogged and fled, with masterminding the revolt, but evidence indicates that others also shared in leadership of this revolt. They made plans to strike at a time when the Spaniards would be low on supplies, just before the arrival of a Spanish supply caravan from the south. Their goals were to cut off the Spanish capital at Santa Fe and overwhelm Spanish settlements in the outlying areas. It required careful planning to coordinate an offensive involving some 17,000 Pueblos living in more than 24 independent towns spread out over several hundred miles and further separated by at least 6 different languages and countless dialects, many of them mutually unintelligible. Runners carrying knotted strings that indicated the number of days until the revolt went from Pueblo to Pueblo under the penalty of death if they revealed the secret. Word of the planned revolt leaked, but Pope advanced the date, and as the Viceroy of New Spain reported to the king the following February, the Indians fell upon all the Pueblos and farms at the same time with such vigor and cruelty that they killed 21 missionary religious, 19 priests and 2 lay brothers, and more than 380 Spaniards, not sparing the defenseless of the women and children. They set fire to the temples, seizing the images of the saints and profaning the holy vessels with such shocking desecrations and insolences that it is indecent to mention them. They left 34 Pueblos totally desolated and destroyed, not counting many other farms and haciendas. Some Indians plunged into rivers to scrub themselves in their clothing, believing that in this way they would be cleansed of the character of the holy sacraments. The Indians laid siege to Santa Fe for 9 days and cut off the town's water supply. Rather than face the prospect of dying from starvation and thirst, Governor Don Antonio de Odermin fought his way through the Pueblo cordon and led about 1,000 Spanish soldiers, their families and servants, in retreat south to El Paso. Bewildered by the scale and success of the uprising, Spaniards interrogated captured Indians to understand how it happened. The coalition that Pope and others had woven together began to unravel soon after the Pueblos had liberated their land. Beginning in 1692, Diego de Vargas reconquered New Mexico for Spain. Pueblos revolted again in 1696, but resistance was promptly crushed. Some Pueblos moved beyond the Spaniards' reach, joining Hopis or Navajos in what is now Arizona. Most opted for more subtle forms of resistance, quietly maintaining their cultures and communities, preserving a Pueblo world within a Spanish colony. The Spaniards, for their part, learned to govern with less of an iron hand. They reduced demands for labor and tribute, and the encomienda system was never reestablished after 1680. They assigned land grants to individual Pueblos, giving them clear European title to their own lands, and they adopted a more tolerant approach to the traditional religion of the Pueblos. Spanish New Mexico in the 18th century became more concerned with defending its northern borders against Apache, Navajo, Ute, and Comanche attacks than it was with subjugating and converting its Pueblo populations. Change occurred at a slower rate and in both directions as Hispanic and Pueblo people interacted and intermarried. The Spanish colony was restored and survived in New Mexico, but not entirely on Spanish terms. Pueblo people had to make adjustments and accommodations in order to survive, but their resistance and resilience also reshaped Spanish New Mexico. The New Mexican borderlands remained volatile and violent places as the repercussions of Spanish colonialism reverberated far beyond the Rio Grande Valley. Many pueblos fought alongside Spaniards in conflicts against Indian peoples to the east, north, and west of New Mexico. Utes and Comanches raided Spaniards, Pueblos, Apaches, and Navajos. Spanish slave raiding expeditions continued to strike deep into Indian country, and some Indian people raided more distant neighbors to feed the Spanish demand for slaves. In the recurrent raiding between Apaches, Navajos, Utes, Comanches, Kiowas, and Hispanos, many people were taken captive, and patterns of captive taking and captive exchange generated cross-cultural kinship connections within and among competing societies. The most profitable part of England's New World Empire during the 17th century lay in the Caribbean. The tiny island of Barbados, colonized in the 1630s, was the jewel of the English West Indies. During the 1640s, a colonial official proclaimed Barbados, quote, "the most flourishing island in all those American parts, and I verily believe in all the world for the production of sugar," end quote. Sugar commanded high prices in England, and planters rushed to grow as much as they could. By mid-century, annual sugar exports from the English Caribbean totaled about 150,000 pounds. By 1700, exports multiplied to 50 million pounds. Sugar transformed Barbados and other West Indian islands. Poor farmers could not afford the expensive machinery needed to refine sugarcane juice into sugar, but planters with enough capital could get rich. By 1680, the wealthiest Barbadian sugar planters were 4 times richer than tobacco grandees in the Chesapeake. The sugar grandees differed from their Chesapeake counterparts in another crucial way. The average sugar baron in Barbados owned 115 slaves in 1680. One way to understand the growing importance of sugar to the Atlantic economy is to equate it in value and wealth production to that of oil in the 20th and 21st centuries. African slaves planted, cultivated, and harvested the sugarcane that made West Indian planters so wealthy. Beginning in the 1640s, Barbadian planters purchased thousands of enslaved Africans to work their plantations, causing the African population on the island to mushroom. During the 1650s, when people of African descent made up only 3% of the Chesapeake population, they had already become the majority in Barbados. By 1700, slaves accounted for more than 3/4 of the island's population. For slaves, work on a sugar plantation was a life sentence to brutal, unending labor. Slaves suffered appallingly high death rates. The work on a sugar plantation at that time ran year-round and nearly round the clock. Only on Sunday was there any rest, English law forbidding any work on the Sabbath. Cane fields required constant tending. Old fields being turned under for replanting, planting at other sites, harvesting going on elsewhere, and of course the processing centers where freshly cut cane was boiled down into granulated sugar. The cane had to be cut quickly and moved even faster to be processed, which meant feeding the cane through a system of grooved rollers set in motion by oxen. The crushed cane would fall into large vats where the pulp was kept at boiling point by constantly tended fires. Gradually, the pulp would be skimmed out until all that is left are the hard sugar crystals at the bottom, which would be formed into cakes and packed for shipment to markets in Europe and America. It was hard, hot work, and accidents were commonplace. Oftentimes, next to the rollers would be a sword or large knife that a slave might have to use to cut off the hand or arm of a careless colleague who, while feeding the raw cane into the rollers, might get his fingers or entire hand caught and crushed with the cane. The work could not stop for much longer than it would take to simply lop off the mangled member, and the pulp too valuable to throw out a vat just because some gore and blood contaminated it. So the bloody pulp would be scooped out as best as possible, and the work would continue while the injured slave hoped that he might get adequate treatment to save his life, which was by no means guaranteed. Slave mortality on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, Central America, and Brazil sometimes reached 50% over any given 5-year period, but the profits from sugar were so immense that the expense of replacing dead or crippled slaves was an easily bearable expense, just another line item on the planter's ledger. Since enslaved men outnumbered women 2 to 1, few slaves could form families and have children. These grim realities meant that in Barbados and elsewhere in the West Indies, the slave population grew very slowly by natural means. Instead, the slave population increased because planters continually purchased more enslaved Africans. Although sugar plantations did not gain a foothold in North America in the 17th century, the West Indies still exerted a powerful influence on the development of slavery in the mainland colonies. The early settlers of what became South Carolina were immigrants from Barbados. In 1663, a Barbadian planter named John Culleton and a group of 7 other men obtained a charter from England's King Charles II to establish a colony north of the Spanish territories in Florida. The men, known as proprietors, hoped to siphon settlers from Barbados and other colonies and encourage them to develop a profitable export crop comparable to West Indian sugar or Chesapeake tobacco. The proprietors enlisted the English philosopher John Locke to help draft the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which provided for religious liberty and political rights for small property holders while envisioning a landed aristocracy supported by bound laborers and slaves. Following the Chesapeake example, the proprietors also offered head rights of up to 150 acres of land for each settler, a policy that eventually undermined the Constitution's goal of a titled aristocracy by spreading land ownership broadly among the settlers. In 1670, the proprietors established the colony's first permanent English settlement, Charlestown, later called Charleston. As the proprietors had planned, most of the early settlers were from Barbados, and they brought their slaves with them. More than a quarter of the early settlers were slaves, and by 1700, slaves made up about half the Carolina population. The new colony's association with Barbados was so close that English officials routinely referred to Carolina in the West Indies. The Carolinians tried to match their semi-tropical climate with profitable export crops of tobacco, cotton, indigo, and olives. Mostly, their experiments proved disappointing. In the mid-1690s, however, colonists identified a hardy strain of rice and took advantage of the knowledge of rice cultivation among their many African slaves to build rice plantations. Settlers also sold livestock and timber to the West Indies, as well as another natural resource. They captured and enslaved several thousand local Indians and sold them to Caribbean planters. Both economically and socially, 17th century Carolina was a frontier outpost of the West Indian sugar economy. By 1700, more than 8 out of 10 people in the southern colonies of English North America lived in the Chesapeake. Until the 1670s, almost all Chesapeake colonists were white people from England. By 1700, however, 1 out of 8 people in the region was a person of African descent. A few black people had lived in the Chesapeake since the 1620s, but the black population grew 5-fold between 1670 and 1700, as hundreds of tobacco planters made the transition from servant to slave labor. Planters saw several advantages to buying slaves. Although slaves cost 3 to 5 times more than servants, slaves never became free. Because the death rate had declined by the 1680s, planters could reasonably expect a slave to live longer than a servant's period of indenture. Slaves also promised to be a perpetual labor force since children of slave mothers inherited the status of slavery. And unlike servants, slaves could be controlled politically. A slave labor system promised to avoid the political problems caused by the servant labor system, such as Bacon's Rebellion. Slavery kept discontented laborers in permanent servitude, and their skin color was a badge of their bondage. The slave labor system polarized Chesapeake society along lines of race and status. All slaves were black, and nearly all blacks were slaves. Almost all free people were white, and all whites were free or only temporarily bound in indentured servitude. Unlike Barbados, however, the Chesapeake retained a white majority. Among white people, huge differences of wealth and status still existed. By 1700, more than 3/4 of white families had neither servants nor slaves. But poor white farmers enjoyed the privileges of free status. They could own property, get married, have families, and pass on their property and their freedom to their descendants. They could move when and where they wanted and associate freely with other people. They could serve on juries, vote, and even hold political office. They could work, loaf, and sleep as they chose. These privileges of freedom, none of them possessed by slaves, made poor white folks feel they had a genuine stake in the existence of slavery, even if they did not own a single slave. By emphasizing the privileges of freedom shared by all white people, the slave labor system reduced the tensions between poor folk and grandees that plagued the Chesapeake region in the 1670s. In contrast to slaves on sugar plantations in Barbados, most enslaved people in the 17th century Chesapeake colonies had frequent and close contact with white people. Slaves and white servants performed the same tasks on tobacco plantations, often working side by side in the fields. Slaves took advantage of every opportunity to slip away from white supervision and seek out the company of other slaves. Planters often feared that slaves would use such seemingly innocent social pleasures for political ends, either to run away or to conspire to strike against their masters. Slaves often did run away, but they were usually captured or returned after a brief absence. Despite planters' nightmares, slave uprisings did not occur. Although slavery resolved the political unrest caused by the servant labor system, it created new political problems. By 1700, the bedrock political issue in the southern colonies was keeping slaves in their place at the end of a hoe. The slave labor system in the southern colonies stood roughly midway between the sugar plantations and black majority of Barbados to the south and the small farms and homogeneous villages that developed in 17th century New England to the north. An important aspect of the development of slavery in the colonial South was the development of two broad types of African American culture. In the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland, where the 17th century African American population peaked at less than one-third of the total population, African American identity was strongly influenced by white British culture. Importations of slaves from West Africa and Angola kept certain native traditions and religious beliefs alive, but only in an adumbrated form. The English spoken by Chesapeake slaves was lightly seasoned with West African words, and aspects of slave cuisine harkened back across the Atlantic. Slaves tended to be dressed more or less identically to the poorest whites. In Carolina, where slaves made up a much larger proportion of the population, peaking at over 40% before 1700, and where more regular importations of slaves from the Atlantic steadily enlarged the number of slaves, West Africanisms had a much greater influence on the African American culture in the Lowcountry. The English spoken was nearly unintelligible to English and Anglo-American observers, so redolent was it with West African words, phrases, and grammatical structure. The style of dress looked more African than English, and the rice-based cuisine of West Africa was almost faithfully replicated in America. Certain religious beliefs and practices formed a vague, non-Christian spiritual framework for those slaves in both regions who showed little or no interest in Christianity, while those few who did convert began to craft a unique African American Christianity that was sometimes at odds with what their masters practiced. By and large, masters discouraged slave Christianization, fearing that it would make them difficult to manage, since Christianity teaches the equality of all before God, and there is a bit of New Testament verse in which the Apostle Paul states unequivocally that no Christian may hold another Christian as a slave. By 1700, the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and Carolina were firmly established. The crops they grew for export provided a livelihood for many, a fortune for a few, and valuable income for shippers, merchants, and the English monarchy. The colonial societies differed from English society in most respects, yet the colonists considered themselves English people who happened to live in North America. They claimed the same rights and privileges as English men and women, while they denied those rights and privileges to Native Americans and enslaved Africans. The English colonies also differed from the example of New Spain. Settlers and servants flocked to English colonies, in contrast to Spaniards who trickled into New Spain. Few English missionaries sought to convert Indians to Protestant Christianity, unlike the numerous Catholic missionaries in the Spanish settlements in New Mexico and Florida. Large quantities of gold and silver never materialized in English North America. English colonists never adopted the system of encomienda, yet important forms of coerced labor and racial distinctions that developed in New Spain had North American counterparts. English colonists employed servants like Anne Orthwood and enslaved Africans while defining themselves as superior to both Indians and Africans. By 1700, the remnants of Powhatan's people still survived. As English settlements pushed north, west, and south of Chesapeake Bay, the Indians faced the new colonial world that Powhatan had encountered when the first colonists arrived at Jamestown. By 1700, the descendants of Powhatan and other Native Americans understood that the English had come to stay. Economically, the southern colonies developed from the struggling Jamestown settlement that could not feed itself into a major source of profits for England. The European fashion for tobacco provided livelihoods for numerous white families and riches for elite planters. After 1700, growing numbers of enslaved Africans were forced to grow tobacco in the Chesapeake and rice in Carolina. The slave society that dominated the 18th century southern colonies was firmly rooted in the developments of the 17th century. A desire for land, a hope for profit, and a dream for security motivated southern white colonists. Realizing these aspirations involved great risks, considerable suffering, and frequent disappointment, as well as seizing Indian lands and coercing labor from servants and slaves. By 1700, despite huge differences in individual colonists' success in achieving their goals, tens of thousands of white colonists who were English immigrants or descendants of immigrants considered the southern colonies their home, shaping the history of the region and of the nation as a whole for centuries to come.